If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. People, what's supernatural, cryptozoological, humanoid, otherworldly creatures, etc., do you believe you have encountered? About 3 years ago, me, my sister, and a cousin were driving back home from the movie theater when we encountered a really strange occurrence. I can't explain the feeling I get, but when I think about it, I get tears in my eyes and feel that fear that spread all through my body when it happened all over again. Basically, I was in the back seat, and my sister was driving. We were on a back road in a very rural county, in the middle of nowhere, Tennessee, and we were about 5 minutes from my house. The stretch of road we were on was completely straight and was surrounded by thick woods. It was pitch black, so you could only see about 100 feet in front of the car. So we were driving, and all of a sudden, about 100 or so feet ahead of us and over a little hill in the road, we saw a large white thing walking across the road in an upright position. In a really weird fashion, it hit us all as absolutely terrifying. With no thought at all, we all started screaming. We drove up on it, and it was no longer standing up. In fact, it was a large white dog. And it just sat down. Right in the middle of the road. I don't know what kind of dog does that. We were all terrified, so my sister drove off the road around it. We kept driving, talking about how scary and off that was, when the craziest thing happened. This is what really scares me to this day. About half a mile up the road, the exact same dog comes walking back into the road. And no kidding, he sat down in front of our car. You can only imagine how terrifying that was. To this day, it scares me to death just to think about it. I saw this thing in the Appalachians while I was on a 55-mile hiking trip. I was with my dog, an absolutely massive husky named Skipper. The area I was in wasn't completely forested. To my right was a vast field that ended in some hills off in the distance, and on my left was dense forest. Me and my dog, were walking just inside the tree line. It was probably pretty close to high noon, and I decided we would stop and eat lunch, but my dog wouldn't sit down. I noticed his tail was between his legs. I wondered if a deer had spooked him or something, but I'd seen this dog fend off bears on some of our previous trips, hunting trips, so a buck shouldn't scare him at all. I followed his gaze out to the field, but nothing was there. I heard the Skipper whimpering behind me. I turned, and I saw that he had shifted his gaze upward. I followed it, but nothing was there. My ears abruptly started ringing as if a grenade had just gone off right in front of me. I was temporarily deaf. Once my hearing had come back into focus, I heard my dog making the strangest noise. It was like a dog bark but elongated into a wail. I turned and saw that her head was reared back, and she was shaking it violently back and forth. Then everything just stopped. Literally all noises ceased. My dog stopped screaming, all the birds stopped chirping, even the breeze stopped. I packed my stuff and booked it out of there. I never saw anything, nor did I hear any inhuman screaming or heavy footfalls. No, just an obnoxious ringing and my dog getting spooked, but I still felt like I was being watched for the whole rest of the trip. Keep in mind that Skipper has only ever gotten scared like that on a couple of occasions, one of which was when I had an encounter with a gang outside of eastern Richmond, California. I have family in California. And even then, she didn't immediately spook. And 2, when something trespassed on my dad's property. He owns a cabin in southern Alaska, and I had to fire 3 shots from a pump-action shotty to scare it off. Skipper hid inside my bedroom's walk-in closet at the sound of the gun. I found her cowering behind a mirror I hadn't mounted on the wall yet. To this day, I still have no idea what was out there. Over my time growing up in SW, Missouri, I have enjoyed camping, birdwatching, and hiking in the Ozarks and Boston Mountains. Many cryptid stories come up, including the howler, razorback, black panthers, giant rat snakes, python size, and the occasional chupacabra. I would like to state the incidents I've had with what I'm thinking is a thunderbird. I have seen an extremely large condor-like bird at least 3 times in my life. I'm 33. Turkey vultures are big, but for the bird in question, from the first time I remember seeing it when I was 8, I would guess the wingspan is at least 12 feet, if not more. In addition, I hiked the Upper Buffalo Wilderness area and saw 2 pop out from the cliffs back in 2008. These are huge. Take a turkey vulture and triple its size. They have a black head and neck, and the neck feathers tufted up gray. There have been only 2 incidents I know of, besides my run-ins, mentioned about a similar bird, one with a farmer seeing one gliding towards Stockton Lake back in 2013. Another was when a birder saw what he thought was a California condor off Bull Shoals. This was back in the late 80s. Has anyone ever seen anything like this or heard anything like this? I feel like I'm nuts for mentioning it. Well, where I was in New Mexico, coyotes are common, and so I knew where I was staying. I was going to see a couple or at least hear them in the night howling, but what weirded me out was that I was eating by the campfire and it was getting a little dark, but I could still see and hear the barking and howling of a coyote. Because I didn't think that a coyote would come near a campfire, but then I realized that it's only one dog that I hear. This is weird because coyotes are pack animals for the most part, and it's getting closer, so I'm chilling out and about to go to bed when I start hearing footsteps that sound like a dog and I can hear it getting closer. And I'm not really in the mood to have that thing eating all my food, so I got a 357 loaded with snake shots, for rattlers and weirdos alike. So I just shot a round into the ground, but I remember hearing something run off, and at this point I was tired and had some more hiking to do in the morning, so I turned in. I woke up a couple more times at night and heard something walking around my tent and campsite. I wasn't really scared of this because, like I said, I have a 357 and most dogs aren't going to try and get into a tent, but I'm not really a big fan of shooting wild animals like that because it's a waste. I eventually walked off after about 15 minutes, so I went back to bed, but when I woke up, there were human footprints. And I thought I was just going crazy, or maybe I mistook it for a coyote, but while I was following the tracks, they slowly turned in the coyote tracks, and that's when I remember a story a friend told me about skinwalkers, and I remember he told me that you don't duck with skinwalkers and the best thing to do is to just get out of Dodge. Okay, I'll start with my sighting. We were cooking dinner and hearing noises all around the campsite, but I still think it was just the noise of the river. Though it did sound like boots sloshing through the river, I also heard faint drumming noises. At this point, I wasn't scared, but my friend was, and I decided I'd have fun with him by shining my flashlight and pretending I was seeing something. The third or fourth time I did this, I saw a gray figure hunched over the ground between two trees, with very long limbs. It bent upward, its head was gray and large, and I noticed two eyes and no features. It seemed to use its elbows a lot, then it just vanished. My friend said I did a double take, all my color drained, and I sat down and kept saying it was a deer. I wasn't scared, I was just like, yeah, I saw something. At various points for the next hour, we kept hearing movement, and I also smelled a rotten egg-like smell float around the air. That smell was in the tent when we got in, and I didn't think anything of it. We then started talking about the various events of the day that involved this weird activity, and then our dead fire started roaring, especially when we said skinwalker. This stopped, and we went to sleep. Earlier in the day, my friend and I went on a brutal hike up Table Mountain, leaving our other two friends to prepare firewood. On our arrival, my friend announced, "I see Nick," but this confused me because I saw no one. My friends and I were both in the tent when we walked in. My friend says he thought he saw a man in a gray t-shirt, keep in mind it's December and it's cold, by one of their bags on the way in. Apparently, they were in the tent the whole time. My friend seemed to get scared at this point. I said it was probably just a hiker. I found out later that while they were in the tent, they heard frequent footsteps around the campsite, so frequent and close to the tent that they thought we had returned and were walking around the campsite. This part of the story could be explained, but if it's people, I think that's even scarier because I've spent months of my life camping. I know it's common practice to make your presence known upon arrival at your campsite, and I know that you don't poke around a site that isn't yours. I'm confused as to why my friends in the tent didn't go tell whoever it was to FK off. Maybe it's good they didn't, there's some weird people in the woods. I do remember feeling a totally different vibe upon our arrival back at the site after our hike. These are some of the details. I'm more concerned with the gray thing I saw in the woods that night. I was never scared, just confused, and I found the quickest thing I could use to explain it away. I didn't see a deer. I see deer every day where I live. I don't really know what I saw. To be made of any sort of fabric, however, as it didn't move or ripple in the high winds like you'd expect of a fabric. It's also worth nothing that this was in September, so there was no snow anywhere on the mountainside. It was quite far away, but even so, I would estimate its height at around 7 or 8 feet. I stopped my descent to stare at it for a second when another hiker passed me and stopped to strike up a conversation. I asked her if she saw that thing up on the cliffside, and immediately she pointed up at the white object and went, "Yeah, that thing that looks like a kid in a white bath towel? I was wondering if you were looking at that when I saw you stop." Mind you, this mountain we're looking at is huge. Like big enough to fill your entire field of view from where we were standing. And out of all that, she knew, even before I said anything, exactly what I was looking at, the weird white pant thing up on the cliff. She described it as a child in a towel, I suspect because the gap between the white pant legs made it look like a white object wrapped around a dark object. I asked her if she had ever heard of the Fresno Nightcrawler, which she hadn't, and as I explained to her what they looked like, she kept staring at the thing on the cliffside and declared, "That's exactly what I'm looking at." I kept stopping to look back at it from different angles as we descended farther down the trail, and each time the perspective shifted in such a way to confirm that it was some sort of solid object, not markings on the granite. I have to believe that it's some sort of strange foreign object that was planted up there or an optical illusion created by a particularly stark white piece of granite cliff, but it was eerie how neatly it appeared to match the Nightcrawler security cam/trail cam footage. This happened a few years ago. When I was younger, I would spend a few weeks at my uncle's cabin each year on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state. On one of these trips during the summer, my family and I were all outside, sitting around a campfire. Later in the night, when the sun had dipped below the mountains and the perimeter of visibility around the fire was greatly reduced, we had a strange encounter. Let me describe the area we were in more to give better context. My uncle's cabin is located on a lake, so on one side of the property is a cabin, and on the other side of the property is a steep cliff down to the water. On either side of the cabin is a neighboring property. The neighboring property on the northern side of the cabin is a largely empty plot of land that consists of a grassy hill that slopes down towards my uncle's property. Anyway, as we are all sitting at the fire, my younger cousin points out the neighboring property. We all look, and clearly in the dark, there is some sort of human-looking creature crouched down on all fours looking back at us. This just happens to be the year when my uncle received one of those 1 million candle flashlights, which is practically a spotlight. When he saw the creature out on the neighboring property, he picked up the flash and turned it on full blast. This gave us all a much better look. I'm still not sure what I saw. It was a completely hairless creature that had 4 legs. Its back 2 legs looked like humans, and its front 2 legs looked similar but were flipped so the knees were facing the wrong direction. All of this was attached to what looked like a human torso with a human head. Again, all hairless. When it realized we had noticed it, it quickly ran off into the trees and tall grass on the edge of the property. We all decided to go inside after this and didn't have any more late-night campfires on this particular trip. I've lived in the middle of nowhere in Minnesota, on the northern border, for all my life. I've heard stories of Bigfoot and other things, but I never really believed. I grew up hunting, fishing, and trapping, and I've seen and heard weird things, but there are 2 experiences that still shake me to this day. The first was an encounter in the winter, which wasn't too bad. Me and my friends went out shopping at the nearest big town, 10,000 people, that was around us. After spending most of the day there, we were heading back to our hometown. We were all having a good time, like high schoolers do. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a figure in a very small field next to a telephone pole. We all went silent after that. This thing was at least over halfway up the pole and completely white. My friends and I went silent for the next hour in our hometown. We never said a word the whole time home. When I dropped one off, he asked if we saw that thing, and the answer was yes. Any of us never spoke about that instance again, even to this day. The other instance occurred when me and another group were out coyote hunting. That one was way more frightening. It was about 3 a.m. in the winter and wasn't particularly cold, at least not enough to snap trees. We were calling for prey in a field that my friend's parents owned for roughly an hour. After a lot of nothing, we heard trees snapping or breaking, but no eyes were showing up in the tree line when we shined the red light. We packed up in our trucks and left about 20 minutes after that. I was driving in front, and to my right, I saw a huge dog-like creature keeping up with us. I drove as fast as I could back to town, and when we finally met the other vehicle at the gas station, they said they saw it following us too. The day after that happened, my friend said that the field we were hunting on was native land and was haunted. I don't know what exactly I saw, but I still get nightmares to this day about both encounters. I am Cree/native, and I live in a community called Mistassini, Quebec. I'm a police officer, and I have been in the force for roughly 10 to 11 years, so as a member of the Ainu police force, you can go to other communities that are under the Grand Council of the Crees. This story takes place in my first year on the force. I was 19 at the time, and I was stationed in another community called Waswanipi. Waswanipi is kind of in a swampy area, and it was a summer night. We've revived a call from a bar that's about 30 to 40 minutes away from Waswanipi. The bar is on a side road and is in, I won't say, a little town, but like a little area where people lived who worked at a mine nearby. So it was my partner, and I responded to the call and drove for about 15 to 20 minutes. I was the one driving the car and had headlights at high beam. As we were driving, we both spotted something laying in the middle of the road, and this thing was big. At first, I thought it was a moose. It's not uncommon to see moose lay on the road because of the heat and mosquitoes. They tend to lay on the road to try and cool off. I started braking the car so hard that tires screeched, and whatever was laying there got up so quick, and this thing was towering over our car. We are usually equipped with Tahoes and Suburbans. These are big SUVs. I'm not sure if it was because of our lights, but it looked like this thing had red eyes looking down at us. I've never felt so scared in my life when I saw its eyes, but the thing roared at us and ran away, and it was fast. My partner was paralyzed with fear when I told him to call backup, so I had to call it in myself, and I remember trying to explain to dispatch about what we encountered without sounding crazy, but after about 15 minutes our backup arrived. We checked out where the thing ran, and honestly, even with backup, I didn't feel safe because that thing was huge and we had Glock's pistols don't do shit to bears. Now you can imagine how I felt with the pistol, knowing that this gun can't bring down a bear on its own and that this thing was bigger than a bear and a moose. We walked a couple meters away to investigate what we encountered. After a few meters, we saw this thing knocking down trees. We decided to walk back to the cars, and you could tell every single one of us was shaken up, and I swear, walking back to the cars, I heard knocking on the trees. After getting back to the cars, I thought to myself that if we had continued following the trail, this thing was leaving behind what would happen to us if we encountered it again. A few days later, people reported sightings of it from Waswanipi to Senatare. In conclusion, I strongly believe I saw a Bigfoot that night. I have no idea where to start. I don't believe in very many cryptids, but this really creeped me out and still has me shaking a few days later. I pulled into my driveway a few days ago at night. I live in a rural area, so there is barely any noise, even during the day. When I'm getting groceries from the back of my car, I hear something that calls my name. It sounds like my sister, who was inside at the time, wasn't talking, was watching TV. The moment I heard it, I moped out and went inside, and I didn't come back out for the rest of the night. I'm not quite sure what I heard or what it could have been. It just sounded exactly like someone I knew, even though I'm sure it wasn't. I haven't encountered anything unusual since then, but the idea of something being out there really gets to me. I do believe some other force was at work, though. I don't want to know what it was or what could have happened to me. As fake as this sounds, I promise this is real. You can believe me if you want, or don't. This still disturbs me and makes me wonder if I really had some sort of encounter. Either way, it is still an unsettling story. My partner and I live on the border of upstate New York, not far from the Whitehall Bigfoot area. One night, my partner was taking out the garbage and came back inside startled, really shook up. They said they had seen a creature that looked like maybe a fox or coyote, but that it then stood up on its hind legs, and so they booked it back inside. Fast forward about a month, and I'm outside on my porch, smoking a cigarette, enjoying the stars under a crystal clear sky. We have a small plot next to our house that has a tow-behind landscaping trailer permanently parked on it, about 20-ish feet away from the house. After a while of standing outside, I get the sudden and intense feeling like something is watching me, just that primal feeling of danger. It should be noted that, like most people up here, I'm usually carrying a gun on me. Coyotes and bears are fairly common up here, so I kind of do the four corners check of my surroundings. When I looked over to that trailer, I saw there was something the size of a large dog laying in the grass. Mind you, it's a clear night with a not quite full moon, and the grass was uncut long but not like a meadow. If I had to estimate, I'd say 7 to 9 inches high, so I had a really good view of this thing. Now I know never to approach a random animal bedded down at night, so I just kind of watch it for a second. Even in the light of the moon, its outline and coat were pitch black, blacker than anything I've seen before, unnaturally contrasting against the ground it lay on. Then it looks up, it has piercing red eyes. I'm thinking, what the duck? And put my hand on my revolver. I ain't about to be coyote food. And then it stood up. It ducking stood up on its hind legs. The only way I can describe the legs of it is like that goat/human hybrid from the Narnia movie, but with the torso like a hybrid of man and canine. It was taller than me, and I'm 6 feet 1 inch. It didn't even need to take a step. I flicked whatever was left of my cigarette and backed away to the door, locked and bolted it, and spent the rest of the night wondering what I just saw. Now, I'll admit, I'm a religious man, but that thing didn't fit the description of any jinn I've heard of. It's one of the few things in my life that I cannot explain to this day. We've installed security cameras since, but now the lot is under construction, and we haven't seen it since. I don't know what I saw that night, truly, but I intend to find out one way or another. I want to go into the forest near the plot and look for signs. Does anyone have any advice on hunting this sort of cryptid? I grew up in the woods and mountains my whole life, and I have seen deer with CWD, and while that is horrible, there is something else out there. I can get into direct stories later, when I have more time, if people are interested. But notably, the few I've seen was a very large deer and was not wasting away or losing mass. It visibly had joints in the normal places, but when it walked, its legs bent between those joints. It also has forward-facing, predatory eyes. In one instance, I was riding my horse, and it chased me almost the full 3 miles home. Another time, it stared at me and my cousin and slowly turned its head nearly upside down from the joint right behind its head. I have researched the chronic wasting disease and have seen deer with it early and up close. That was not what I saw the times I've seen this thing. All I know is that it is not a deer. My cousin used to live in northern Alabama, and his family had a polo field about 20 or 30 miles from the Tennessee state line. He had told me a couple of times back when he lived on the property he'd see this figure around his property, outside his windows, out in the field, stuff like that, but these were stories late at night on Xbox, and I never put too much thought into them. Flash forward to a trip. I went up to visit him around 2010, and we went camping on the polo field. It was a cool August night with a full moon, and we set up our tent and set out in the middle of the field. We had made food and were just shooting the shit and listening to music when we started getting some strong cold and hot winds. The area was known for tornadoes, so we decided to pack up and leave. We had gotten most of the stuff back in the car, and I decided to lay back up on top of one of the hay bales and just look at the night sky because I hadn't seen a full night sky after moving to a city with high light pollution. After a couple of minutes, my cousin tells me everything is packed and we're ready to go, so I hop up and look out across the field, and at the edge of the field, at the fence line about 75/100 yards away, I see it. This human-like silhouette is just standing right at the fence, looking right in our direction. I knew the fences were about 4 feet tall, and they were sitting above the fence's waistline, so it appeared to be over 6 feet, near 7 feet tall. It looked human, but some just seemed off. Its limbs were thin, and its eyes were reflective like those of an animal. I couldn't make out a lot of facial features, but it just seemed flat and grayish/pale. The best way I could describe it was as a mix between the rake and the vampires from I Am Legend. I quickly hopped down, told my cousin to leave, and explained what I saw after we got back to his parents. From what I described to him, it matches what he saw 5 to 8 years prior, when he was a kid. There's a few stories of his other friends seeing it around the woods a couple of years later when they'd camp, but no one really has an explanation of what it could be or what it is. We've looked into the area, and there was an old asylum abandoned in the late 80s and early 90s, but given the span of around 15 years it was seen, we don't think it could be some weirdo living out there. Has anyone seen anything matching what this could be around the northern Alabama/South Tennessee area? Does anyone know what this could be? Approximately 5 years ago, I was driving home from my job as a correctional officer at Cook County Jail in Chicago, Ill. My shift ended at 11 p.m., and it took me approximately 35 to 45 minutes to drive home from work. As I always did, I would call my wife and let her know I was safe from my shift, and typically she would keep me company on my Bluetooth while I drove home. Every night when I drove home, I took the Midlothian Turnpike, a few blocks out of the exit of the motorway. Midlothian Turnpike will also lead you to the location of Bachelor's Grove Cemetery. Please research Bachelor's Grove Cemetery. As I drove past Bachelor's Grove Cemetery, a figure that I can only describe as a pterodactyl flew over my car and across the road into the woods on the other side of the street. I screamed, as I thought I was going to hit something. My wife is still on the phone now, yelling and asking me what is going on and if I am okay. I had to get my bearings together, but I was so scared. I thought about stopping at the gas station ahead, but I knew I was close to home. When I got home, we had a good laugh about it. 2 days ago, I told this story to my boss. He asked if I knew what Mothman was. I heard of it but wasn't familiar with its stories. When I look back now, many things happened that I believe may have been a result of my encounter. I probably won't talk about this again, as I don't expect anyone to believe me, and I don't want to feed it any energy to come back. When I was really young, probably about 5 or 6, my family went camping. At the tippy top of the mountain, you really couldn't get higher on said mountain. There was a lake we were camping next to, so of course my family was fishing. My dad and mom, my uncle, and I were on the shore, trying to catch some fish. Across the shore, on the other side of the small lake, my dad had noticed a huge brown or black humanoid figure, just standing still and facing right at us. It had to be 8+ feet tall, maybe even taller since it was so far away. So, like any human would naturally do, my dad tried yelling at it, since he had thought it was a prank of some sort. I don't remember what my dad said, but I remember the sound the creature made. It wasn't anything we understood, just a kind of unintelligible screeching. It did, however, sound like he knew what he was saying, if that makes sense. Like he was saying something to us, only in his language. We were all looking at it at that point. My grandparents and my big brother had joined us. I remember my parents attempting to recreate the screeches he was saying, and he would respond. This went on for just a couple of minutes. Then the creature took off. And I mean, took off. Mind you, the entire time, he was on 2 feet, much like a human. He turned and started running towards the forest, and he was out of sight in seconds. He had to have been running like 25 to 30 miles per hour. My brother, grandpa, and dog tried chasing it, definitely the smart thing to do, and went to where we had seen him in the direction he left in. They did find a huge lump of black hair that was stuck in a barbed wire fence, although I'm not certain it was really from the creature. Tell me why we didn't leave. We spent the night still in tents. It was very windy, and I don't think anyone actually slept. I think about it from time to time, but it honestly isn't that rare of an encounter in Utah. I've seen UFOs, my siblings have seen skinwalkers, my brother was followed by a UFO, and I lived right by a skinwalker ranch my whole life. I promise my family is not a bunch of kooks. Well, maybe a little, but not in the sense that we all had the same encounter. Back in 2013, me and my cousin had an encounter with the Mohau Man, Bigfoot. So me and my cousin were both 18 at the time, we just finished our last year in high school, and we were on our end-of-year holidays, and we both had no idea what we were going to do on our break. My cousin suggested that we go spend a week up on the coast with one of my grandfathers. Now, before I move on, we live in a small town called Gisborne, with a population of 40,000. And the coast is pretty much the rural area near my town. All bush and forest, pretty much. And our family has a homestead in a small settlement called Waipiro Bay. Our grandfather was happy we were there to spend some time with him. I was happy to be there, just something about being in the bush relaxes and clears my mind. Anyway, after a long day of hearing sheep and cutting up wood, our grandfather told us that we should go spotlighting for eels for our dinner. We waited till around 2000 hours, and off we went. Now my grandfather's house is on this hill, and right below it, at the back of his house, is this trail that leads to a creek trail. The creek trail is about a 1-hour walk, and the sides are fully covered in thick brush. Unfortunately, the eels were too small to catch. We got to the end of the trail and turned back the way we came. As we were walking back, we started hearing these weird squeals coming from the lefts, and off he went. Me and my cousin both just looked at each other, let's let this sigh of relief out, and carried on back to the house. We never said a word on our way back, we were just silent. We get back to the house, and grandfather says, "No luck on the eels?" And my cousin replies, "I think we just saw the Mohau Man." My grandfather looks at us and says, "Yeah, I've seen him around a few times as well, I just leave him be." I was shocked when she said that. I was like, "Wait, you've seen him?" My grandfather said, "Yup, I've seen him when I'm out hunting, he's come to the house a few times, but he doesn't come too close, though." So I just let him be, and he also told us he didn't want us to go out and look for him either, like we were going to do that, but my grandfather believes that the Mohau Man is some ancient guardian that watches over the local forest near him. I'm 28 now, and I still think at night. The only other person I've told this story to is my partner. She believed me, and she's also had some pretty weird encounters and experiences before we met. I think I was around 10 years old. I had to go somewhere with my mom. It was like 4 a.m. I know it's a weird time to go somewhere. We got into the car, but she forgot something in the house and went to get it. I stayed in the passenger seat to wait. It was taking her a few minutes to find whatever she needed. I remember suddenly getting a really scared feeling for no reason. Something is wrong. I started looking around to see if anyone was by the car or something, but there was no one I could see. But then I looked in the passenger side mirror. And I saw what looked like an alien. I mean classic gray. But it had weird things on the sides of its head. I don't even know how to explain what they looked like. I just remember that I started panicking. I kept looking away and then back in the mirror again, and it was still there. All it did was stand there and stare at me. I didn't move, blink, or do anything. It seemed like it took forever for my mom to get back, but finally she did come back out. We pulled out of the driveway and left. I never saw it again, but I do still dream about it sometimes. Is there any way this could have been my childhood imagination? I was awake and only slightly tired. But once I saw it, I was wide awake. My mom grew up in Venezuela. My grandpas escaped there during the Civil War, and with their savings, they bought a small farm and some property in the capital. Anyway, this all happened when she was 8 or 9, so around 1962-63 at my grandparents' farm. Back then, radio was all the rage, and they had just bought a fancy new radio for the farm. It must have been like 11 or 12 a.m., and my grandpas were sleeping, but my mom was up hearing radio shows. It was kind of a hot night, so the balcony and most of the windows in the living room were open. She was starting to fall asleep, so she decided to call it a night and turn off the radio. She went to close the balcony window, and that's when she saw it. It was a small creature, just a little smaller than her. And it was hunched over behind a large sofa, just watching at her. It had very large, almond-shaped black eyes and grayish leathery skin, with arms longer than its body. She said it kind of looked like a gorilla in the way its arms touched the floor. Obviously, she screamed at the top of her lungs. The creature seemed to panic and ran to grab her arm and pull her towards the balcony, but she resisted long enough for my grandma and grandpa to arrive. The little guy let go of her arm and escaped through the balcony before my grandpa could reach him. My grandpa went out looking for Gray for the better part of an hour, but he didn't find anything. They all slept in the same bed that night, and they never left the windows open at night ever again. Now, here's the kicker. I figured she had just made up that story. Back when I was a kid, I was really into aliens and the supernatural, and I figured she had just made up a story to entertain me. But when I asked my grandma about it one night, she told me her side of the story. And she gave me an almost perfect description of the little guy. My grandmother is also a very serious person, so I really doubt she would have told me something like that as a joke. Even as a kid. Sadly, I could never get my grandpa's side of the story because he died soon after I was born. But it's a story I always remember from time to time, 'cause it really freaked me out as a kid. This happened about 10 years ago, when I lived in Limestone, a small town in Maine. For reference, I lived in a small apartment complex completely surrounded by forest. It was very quiet, and lots of wildlife roamed the fields and forests surrounding the complex. I was 8 years old, lying on the top bunk of my bed, looking out my window. There was a spider that would build her web right outside my window, so I would always watch her build her web at night before I went to sleep. My window overlooked a parking lot that was right next to a field bordering a thick forest. One night I was watching Mrs. Spider build her web, as I always do, when I saw this very tall, ape-like thing with a long, thick tail that tapered at the end, kind of like how you would imagine a T-Rex tail. Except hairy, if that's a good comparison, walking across the parking lot. I kept watching as it wandered into the field just before the forest. It then placed itself in between two trees, about arm's length away from each other, and began climbing up by grabbing the two opposite trees with its respective hands and feet and slowly shimmying up the tree. As it made it to the tops of the trees, it sort of blended in with them and stopped moving, and I couldn't see it anymore. To this day, I am completely stumped as to what I saw from my apartment window. This happened around the year 2000. About a year after this took place, I started dating one of these friends, and that's when I first heard about this dog/wolf story. I have since asked each friend, over years and miles apart, and they all remember the same encounter. Before my ex was even my boyfriend, let's call him Jay, he and our other friends were about 17 to 18 years old. At that age, I remember it being an adventure to find a place to smoke. Let's hike to underscore and puff. Ah, good old days, when we got away from our parents and planned a day around smoking. It was Jay and his best friend B, and their girlfriends, S and M. The four of them decided to drive to Mount Pisgah, a beautiful wooded area outside of Eugene, Oregon. It's more of a hill, but it's nature in its prime, for sure. I've been out there many times growing up, and I know exactly what trail they were on, the main one that connects the parking lot to the river. They had driven in B's little white sedan, parked in the parking lot, and then walked to the river. On the way to the river from the lot, there is a very small bridge that crosses a small creek, relevant for later. The group spent the day out there, swimming and puffing and swimming, just being typical Oregonian teens. I can imagine that hunger is what drove them to go home after a few hours, as the sun began to set. Either activity alone is bound to get someone hungry, let alone both. So, they walked along the well-worn main dirt path to the parking lot. It doesn't take but 20 minutes or so for them to get back to the little footbridge by the parking lot that they had crossed when they hiked in. When they reached this small footbridge near the parking lot, B looked out into the vast field between them and the wooded mountain and noticed a huge dog near the tree line, about 100 yards away. They all later described it as the biggest dog they had ever seen. The dog was just sitting there, not looking scary, just looking like a humongous, friendly dog. It was starting to get dark, but from M's and J's descriptions, and the drawing she did for me later in 2005, it was very shaggy and furry. My friends continued to walk across this small wooden bridge, and one of the girls screamed. The big dog was now on its hind legs, standing much closer than when they had seen it just a couple of seconds earlier. It had traversed most of the large field in the seconds it took them to get across this 10-foot-long bridge. Whatever this thing was, it was fast, quiet, and stealthy. My four friends ran to the car, and they had the classic, cliché "I can't get the key in," because B was fumbling madly for the keys. At this point, the dog was standing, on its legs, at the very edge of the parking lot, looking at them. I still had the dog face, and I still had the dog body, standing up. They never saw it walking, on all four or just two. It was like every time they looked up, it was just standing there, closer. As Jay had said, every time they looked up, he was closer but not moving. All of them recounted how surreal it was to see a dog standing on its hind legs. I don't know if it ran for a few ticks and then stood up again at intervals in the field, but that's the way they describe it. Many times I asked them, "Are you sure it wasn't a bear?" No. It definitely was a dog standing on hind legs. A big dog that was stalking them. Also, this is in Lane County, Oregon, in the year 2000. There are few, if any, bears out there. It would be odd, but then again, I wasn't there. The kids got into the car and sped off, leaving the Pisca dog to his own business. I've never had a reason to doubt any of their stories. In fact, S doesn't like to talk about the incident at all because it's too creepy for her to recall. I was on holiday with my parents, and one night, as the three of us were walking at around midnight, my dad and I saw a church and felt strangely drawn to it. We decided to take a look, and the doors were open and the lights were on. I'm not religious, so I wouldn't know if this is the same for every church. We went in and stood in there for a few minutes, just looking around. Then there was an extremely loud knocking above us. It was like someone was pounding at the roof with a sledgehammer. There was no one in there. I checked outside, and there was no one there or in the street. This happened 3 times. I then noticed a small graveyard that was connected to the church. We like spirits and stuff like that, so we thought we'd take a look at it. Now is the interesting part. Something was standing in front of me, no more than 3 meters away. It looked like a fox mixed with a cat and was the size of an adult fox. It was just standing there, staring at me. I could barely see it as there were no streetlights. I took a few steps forward to try and get a closer look, but it fled to under a table sort of thing. I can't remember what it was, but I couldn't see it well either. I turned the flashlight on my phone and shone it under the table. It was now the size of a large dog and was staring at me again. As soon as I took my flashlight off of it to talk to my dad, I heard leaves rustling and looked at it one last time before it disappeared up a hill into the woods. From under the table, it has sprinted incredibly far in the split second. I turned to my dad and was the size of a fox again as it ran away. We never found out what we saw. A few years ago, in my previous home, I saw a strange aberration in the hallway by my son's room. It looked like a hazy, distorted image of a humanoid figure. I did not think much of it and thought it was just my mind thinking something was there that really wasn't. It occurred a few times, but then one day I heard my son screaming and crying. I could tell from his cry that it was something serious and not him just being upset about something. I ran into his room, and he was crying, saying that there was a big, scary man in his room and scaring him. It was one of the weirdest and scariest moments of my life. I knew there was no one else in the house. But I could tell my son was truly terrified of whatever had just happened to him. My wife was with me when this happened, and afterward, she told me she had seen the same thing I had seen but also thought nothing of it. We had a spare bedroom by the kids' room where the grandparents stayed when they were in town. They also spoke of hearing footsteps at night and voices. I personally never experienced those, but that just made the whole situation even stranger. Has anyone else ever encountered something like this? My partner and I like to hike at a local park late at night. It's a 3,500-acre historic park in Pennsylvania that stretches all the way into Maryland and Delaware. One of the trails allows you to cross through all 3 states. The entire park is mostly dense woods, with a creek running through. Usually we park near an old church with a Revolutionary War cemetery that is famous for a grave known as the Ticking Tomb. I've been to every corner of this park, day or night. We usually hike a short loop that is roughly a half mile in length. We've walked this trail literally thousands of times and never once felt anything strange. But tonight was different. We made a spontaneous decision to go on a night hike and left the house at about 10:45 p.m. I decided to take the narrow dirt road to our usual parking spot rather than driving a mile up the road to a paved access road like we normally do. About halfway down the ragged dirt and gravel road as we rounded a corner, an animal dashed across the road in the path of our headlights. I've never seen anything like this animal, and I've never seen an animal that size in this area that I couldn't immediately identify. Its size was somewhere between a dog and a human, and it moved so quickly that it almost looked like it flew. A literal black blur with some hazy details and bright silver eyes. My partner also saw it. I'm generally a skeptic, so I just wrote it off, and we both just kind of explained it away. We made it to our parking spot and pretty much resolved not to talk about it and continue on as usual. Immediately when we got out onto the trail, we noticed the frogs and cicadas were extremely loud, louder than I've ever heard them at night around here. As we progressed down the trail, it felt like we had to talk over the cicadas. We sort of quietly, yet frantically, attempted to lighten the mood with conversation. Unbeknownst to me at the time, about 100 meters down the trail, my partner had begun to hear what he thought were extremely distant voices. I also noticed that the cicadas got progressively quieter the further we got down the trail. We made it about a quarter mile before a sudden, louder sound felt like it cut through the space between my ears. It was something like a glitching microphone or megaphone, way off in the distance. My partner pointed out to me later that there was nothing for the echo to bounce off of in that area. The moment we heard that sound, I stopped immediately and asked if he heard it, too. Not only had he heard it, but he was convincing himself that he was hallucinating the sounds the entire time until I finally acknowledged it. Without discussion, we both immediately turned around and started walking at a fast pace back to the car. I felt like it was a bad idea to run, but we had to leave right away. We hoofed it back to the car with the feeling that something was following us all the way to the entrance. When we finally got back into the car and started driving, the feeling of urgency didn't go away. We made it all the way down the main road to our first turn, and I felt a moment of complete confusion. As I slowed to the turn, my partner asked me, "Do you not know where you are right now?" Because neither do I. We have literally driven this road thousands of times. I made a split-second decision to turn right, which was thankfully the right choice. The next road went along the perimeter of the park and parallel with the trail we were hiking. There was tons of fog, which hadn't been there on our way in. We spent maybe 20 minutes at the park. Just as we made our way past the area that we had turned around, another animal darted across the road in front of our headlights. It looked exactly like the one we saw on our way in, only closer and in more detail. It had silver eyes and what looked like ears or horns. It was still insanely fast and either a blur or a wraith. I don't know how else to describe it. I get this really weird feeling when I think about it or talk about it. The feeling started when I saw it run across the road the second time. I feel like it's because I acknowledged that, whatever that thing was, I couldn't explain it. I feel an almost burning sensation in my sinuses, my eyes water, and I get a strange tingling in the back of my skull. Like I said before, I'm usually a skeptic when it comes to this kind of stuff. But this experience has left me rattled. So a friend of mine and her boyfriend were on a deer lease in Louisiana near an old Native American burial grounds and saw what was described as a 7-foot-tall white bony creature with red eyes by one account and orange by the other, no nose, described as being an empty hole, and red, long, bony fingertips. There was a distinct stench of mildew and ammonia, described as old horse piss in a stall, when the creature got close to them. Once sighted, my friends quickly got in their vehicles and began trying to escape. Reportedly, a creature followed them for roughly a mile. The creature did not run beside the vehicle but rather tracked them about a mile down a dirt road and found them, even beating on the driver's window at one point during the second sighting and mimicking the sounds of a raccoon growling during the first. As it happened, they were out setting traps for raccoons, which tells me they were being watched beforehand. An eerie feeling was also reported just prior to the first sighting, almost like being watched. We think it could be some kind of guardian spirit, vengeance demon, mimic, or potentially a fleshy pedestrian or skinny boy, avoiding the real name due to the lore behind it, but we are open to suggestions as none of these match 100% of the given description. Simply trying to identify it. Location: Valles de la Chila, Monterrey, Nuevo León, Mexico. 21-year-old police officer Leonardo Samaniego Gallegos was patrolling a section of Alamo Street when he observed what appeared to be the figure of a woman totally dressed in a black cloak-like outfit descend from a nearby tree towards his patrol car. She appeared to float towards the car at very high speed. She had large black eyes without any pupils. Terrified, he drove away from the area but was chased by the flying apparition. He called for assistance over his police radio. The tree from which the strange figure descended was about 6 meters high. The strange flying creature approached the police car and impacted the front windscreen, pushing it inward, apparently trying to get in using what appeared to be large pointy claws. At this point, Gallegos lost consciousness. In the videotaped interview, Officer Gallegos describes the eyes and black gown as in the news article, but adds the description of a helmet or headpiece it was wearing that curved downward to a point at the back of the creature's head. Also, a police officer from Santa Catarina, Jorge Contreras, declared that he and 2 more policemen from the Regia Police saw exactly the same flying being that Officer Samaniego saw, but 3 days before. They saw it flying and decided not to say anything, until they heard about Samaniego's case. Norma Alicia Herrera, who lives in Colonia La Playa, declared in a TV interview that she and her brother also saw the flying humanoid during the day and that it looked weird. She said that her brother was so stunned by the sighting that he was sick for almost a week afterwards. Another neighbor in that sector also videotaped a strange flying humanoid several days ago and gave the video to the TV station. I live in Colorado. This happened when I was 6. Our family was taking a trip up to the mountains, specifically to a cabin owned by my aunt and uncle's family. Near this cabin was a discontinued railroad project that even tunneled through a mountain. When this happened, it was near the end of the winter months. The result was that I spent much more time researching cryptids. The entire day had felt off to me. We went on a hike, and I couldn't hear any birds or animals, and when we were turning around, I started getting excited because I smelled something coppery and thought it might be copper. I smelled the copper. As we walked back, my dad kept glancing behind us at random intervals. It was only that night that I actually noticed anything while I was there. There was one bedroom, perfect for a family of 4. But it had one window. I never trusted that window, and I was right not to. That night, my parents were up much longer than usual but stayed silent. After they fell asleep, I was pondering their weird behavior. And at what I would guess was close to 2 a.m., I felt something. The room cooled down, and I felt horribly cold for a moment. I felt pure dread, and along with the chill, I could almost feel what seemed like hunger of some sort, burning my face at an angle from the window. Whatever it was, it knew I was awake, and it knew that I could tell it was there. Then I felt it. That same feeling of if I don't do this, I won't get a chance to correct that mistake. So I got up as high as I could and jumped off of the top bunk where I was supposed to sleep. Then I turned on a lamp and pointed it at the window while it was in my hands. Whatever it was, we had a mutual feeling of, no, I don't like this one. It was pale in the light, and my fear probably made me the same color. All that I could see in the window was a nearly white head with pits for eyes, no lips, and slightly larger and sharper than normal bloodstained teeth, as well as its thin yet broad shoulders and a single, blood-red hand with abnormally long fingers that ended in needle-like points that were hovering, poised to shatter the window. A few seconds after the light hit it, it opened its mouth and let out a muffled scream, blocked slightly by the window, then vanished to the right. The scream woke everyone up, and I was still standing in the dark, pointing a lamp at a window, looking horrified. My parents finally got me to sleep. I don't really know how they managed that. But the next day, while we were heading out, I looked at that window from outside and realized something even more horrifying. This thing had to be at least 8 feet tall, just to be able to look at the bottom of the window, because there was a ditch around the edge of the cabin. We took one last hike around 9 a.m. when we looked back in that tunnel. The rocks in the tallest pile had shifted. There was now a deer antler sitting near the top of the shifted pile, and there were now pools of a shiny liquid in the cave. The scent of copper was prominent in the area, and now even the fish in the nearby stream wouldn't surface for air or insects. I would like reassurance on what I saw, but I'm not sure. Next winter, me and 3 friends of mine are going back to the cabin to go hunting. I lived alone, and in this remote location, we don't have cable, so the only option is satellite TV. It was a humid summer night in July, and the TV was acting up, so I needed to go out and readjust the satellite like usual. I took a flashlight and a gun with me. When I went outside, it was unusually quiet. I also purchased an or due to other sightings I've had, but they weren't credible enough to chalk it up as a dogman. Being so silent was unnerving. I brushed the thought off and went to the dish, which is in the corner of my yard. I went to work, making sure all the wires were all right and pointing them at a different angle. Suddenly I heard a small snap of a stick to my left and turned the flashlight in that direction, and I saw a creature standing there. I got a good look at it for what seemed like an eternity, but it was for only about 10 seconds. I slowly backed off, ran back to the house, and locked all the doors and windows. The creature was unlike anything I had ever seen before. When I shined the light at it, the first thing I saw was the head. It has cropped ears that point upwards. Its snout was narrower than a bear and longer, and I could make out large teeth protruding from the jaw. Its eyes were a deep red shade that seemed to reflect off the light I was pointing at them. The body was muscular and huge. It had long arms that appeared to be longer than its legs. Broad shoulders that tapered into a skinnier waist. It was slightly crouched over when I saw it, with one hand wrapped around a small tree. I could make out the legs, which looked similar to a dog's legs. They had obvious hocks. Even with the crouched position, it was about my height, which is 6 feet. Standing up to full height, this creature could easily be 7.5 feet tall. The fur was black and thicker around the neck and chest, and the bottom half was significantly less so. I don't know if it was aggressive or not. What I know is that I had a feeling of dread, unlike anything I've ever experienced. Was it just observing me or stalking me? For a creature this large, it was deceivingly silent. It got within 15 yards of me without me noticing. All I knew was that I needed to get out of there and not find out. I don't live on the property anymore, but after the event, I never had another face-to-face encounter. But I would hear sounds in the woods that I couldn't explain. They would start off relatively quiet and work their way up to furious howls and screams, then back down to quiet again. I don't know if this was the same thing because it could be local wildlife. The location where this encounter took place is Highway 43, Wise River, in case you want to look up the location online. Last summer, me and my brother took a walk through the woods at Silver Falls State Park in Oregon. The forests were beautiful and cool, so we figured why not and took a path into the trees. We were pretty far down the path when it happened. Our cabins were far out of view and out of earshot, and we had just turned a corner and began going up the side of a cliff when my brother froze. I asked him what was wrong, and he was near tears as he told me he wanted to go back. We jogged back to the cabins, checking our backs constantly, and he told me he saw a black streak that was the shape of a human, with a long nose, bald head, and skinny limbs, dashing silently along the foliage before disappearing completely behind a tree. I've never seen my brother in this state. He was crying and shaking. I've been thinking about it. Could it have been a cryptid? Maybe whatever that was, if it wasn't just my brother's imagination, is what snatches up people in the blink of an eye in 411 cases? We ventured back to the spot later that same trip with about 4 more people, excluding my brother, who refused to return, and looked around. Saw nothing. It was definitely no jogger or fellow camper. I talked to my brother again today about it, and he described it in the same way. A shorter, black human-shaped thing runs silently past before vanishing behind a tree. I want to mention that we had a big black raven or crow hanging around back at our cabin the entire time. I've read that skinwalkers take animal shapes, and that particular animal form was a popular one. First off, I should say that this wasn't actually my encounter, but that of a close friend, and one I trust completely, so I'm telling it exactly as he told it to me. I live in Pittsburgh, and the suburbs of the city are where this encounter occurred. My friend was driving around with 2 other people in the car and pulled into the student parking lot of the local high school at around 11 p.m. to have a cigarette and decide what he and his friends would do for the rest of the night. All were completely sober, just to add a little more credence to the story. After pulling into the lot, which isn't very well lit at night, they saw that there was a black sedan parked on one end of the lot. They decided to drive past it to see if anyone was inside, as it seemed strange that a car would be left there. The lot is almost always empty at night if there isn't a football game or anything like that going on. As they drove past, they saw a figure with glowing yellow eyes peeking over the bottom edge of the window on the passenger side. It blinks and moves a bit as they watch. It freaked everyone out, so they left. About a half hour later, they decided to go back and see if the car was still there. It was, but it had moved to a different parking spot. As they drove past again, the creature popped up from the back seat and turned to look at them. It scared all of them pretty badly, and they left in a hurry. Has anyone heard of anything like this before? The fact that the creature was inside the car is very bizarre, and I can't find any similar stories out there. I was about 16 at the time, and I am half indigenous. I was visiting my uncle on my mom's side, the indigenous side, at his cabin located in the woods of northwestern Maine because I was driving my grandpa up to visit them for the fall season. The cabin was rather small and could only accommodate my uncle, auntie, and grandpa, so I was told to sleep in the camper that was set back further into the woods. That evening went by as usual. Auntie made dinner, and we all laughed and shared stories and eventually turned in for the night. I took a flashlight and started my way out to the camper. About halfway down, I shut off the flashlight and looked up to admire the night sky. It was at this point that I noticed how quiet the forest had become. There were no birds, sounds of crickets, or rustling leaves, just pure silence. I suddenly got this intense feeling of dread deep within my gut, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. The voice in my head told me to bolt to the camper as fast as I could. For some reason, my instincts told me I didn't belong there, and something was watching me. When I made it to the camper, I slammed the door shut and double-locked it, closing the window blinds. I swear I could hear my heart pounding in my ears as I laughed at myself for getting so worked up over nothing. The entire night, I was restless in my sleep. I couldn't help but hear footsteps and movement all around the camper. I told myself it was just curious animals and grazing deer, but my dreams were haunted by something I couldn't see. Unfortunately, this would not be my final experience of the weekend. By morning, all seemed normal. I thought about mentioning what had happened to my grandfather over breakfast, but I was worried that he would brush me off as being overly dramatic or too used to city life. I let the odd night slide off my mind as I enjoyed the day with my family and their big shepherd Frank. Just to calm my nerves, I asked for Frank to accompany me in the camper that evening to ensure I felt safe. The walk back was once again fine until I began to enter the tree line. I'm not sure if it was because I was feeling nervous as well, but Frank seemed to be on edge with his ears perked and his head on a swivel. That night, he slept in the bed of the trailer with me. I felt safer with the dog there. However, I had an extremely awful dream in which, when I awoke, Frank was staring at the wall of the trailer with his hackles standing on end. When the morning hit, I packed my bags to leave in the afternoon, brought Frank out of the trailer, and led him out to the small field between the cabin and the thick woods. I was kicking his ball for him to excitedly chase, grab, and return to me. We continued this game until I kicked the ball a bit too hard, and it rolled right down to the edge of the woods. Frank raced down to grab the ball until his full sprint turned into a full stop, digging his paws into the dirt meters past where the ball had landed. He was standing stiff, fur on end, ears pinned back, and unmoving. I called for him to come, which he always responded to, but he didn't even acknowledge me. I began to walk down to where he was, calling his name a little bit louder, still with no response. I grabbed him by the collar, getting kind of worried at this point as his eyes stared directly into the trees. I yelled his name loudly, giving him a little tug. The forest was silent. Moments later, the silence was broken by an echo of my voice yelling back. However, this echo was delayed and distorted. It sounded like me, but also not like me. I froze and looked into the dark woods, holding my breath, only for another scream to come from the woods in my voice. I immediately turned and booked it back to the cabin. I came to my aunt crying and trying to tell her that there was something out there in those woods. She comforted me and told me it must have been nothing, but she seemed as if that was not the answer she wanted to give. My family is rather superstitious, especially me, and I'm guessing she didn't want me to overthink anything. I left that afternoon, and I have not been back since that weekend. About 13 years ago, when I was 9 or 10 years old, my parents and I had just moved up to a mountain in the Gold Coast hinterland, Tambourine Mountain, in Australia. Absolutely beautiful place, full of national parks and tropical rainforests. To explain the layout of our old property, there was the main house, and about 100 meters to the left of the main house was a large shed. Separating the main house from the shed was a garden area with a little path leading from the shed to the house. It was just after dark, maybe 7 p.m., and my mom was inside the main house making dinner, and for some reason I was outside with my dad at the shed whilst he was unloading things from the back of a truck with one of his mates. I helped for a little bit, but when it came to the bigger objects, I was just sitting around and admiring our beautiful new property. I can still remember this as if it happened yesterday. So I'm sitting down and waiting for my dad to finish up so we can go back to the main house, and for some reason, and to this day I still do not know why, I had this intense urge to look over to my right into the bushes that separated the main house from the shed. At first, I couldn't really tell what it was, but the longer I stared at it, the more I realized it was not a trick of the light or my imagination. About 30 feet away from me was a small thing walking parallel to where I was sitting, wading through the bushes. It was walking at a normal pace, but pushing the bushes back to make way for itself. I could only see the side profile of this thing, but I could see that over its body it was wearing something black, almost like a black cloak. From the side profile of its face, I could make out a pointed nose with sharp cheekbones and a large hole where I'm assuming its eye was. It was probably about 3 or 4 feet high and had the stature of a small child. I saw it for probably about 5 seconds. I think that was probably the first time in my life that I had an adrenaline rush. My heart dropped to my stomach, and I felt sick and confused. I couldn't speak or move, all I could feel was utter fear and terror in this thing. I stood up and quickly bolted inside the shed and waited for my dad to finish up because no way in hell was I going to walk back to the house by myself. It never looked at me, for all I know, it could have been before, but when I saw it, it did not look at me or acknowledge me. I didn't sleep in my own bed until I was 13 after that experience. I was utterly scared of the dark, and still to this day, I don't like going outside after dark by myself. The older I got, the more I began to research paranormal topics. I'd tried for so long to convince myself that this was just a hallucination, but I know in my heart it wasn't. The best description that I could give it would be that it looked like an alien gray, but the thing is, it still had proportionate features, if that makes sense. I know this sounds insane, but it had the features of a goblin, pointed ears, and a sharp cheekbone. It was definitely wearing something black over the top of its shoulders, as I did not see legs. The most frightening aspect of this experience for me is that, to this day, I still have weird nightmares about that property. I've never forgotten that night or how it has molded and changed my perception of this world. There is so much more out there that we don't know about. Has anyone else ever had an experience similar to this? When I was 10 years old, I lived in a house in North London with my parents. Opposite our house was a field where we used to walk our dog in the morning. On this particular morning, I walked the dog by myself. It was a pretty safe neighborhood, and I was literally 5 minutes from the house. So, I was out walking the dog, who was a Cavalier King Charles, so he was usually very docile and friendly. We were walking through the field along a path that heads towards the back of the field when suddenly my dog stopped in his tracks and just stared ahead of us. The fur on his back was raised, and he started to growl. I looked in the direction his eyes were glaring and noticed, about 15 meters or so away, a tall, lanky-looking creature. It was approximately 6 feet tall, and it had long digits on its hand. Due to the distance, I couldn't really make out if these were fingers or claws. It was hunched forward, sort of like when a chimpanzee changes from standing to running on all fours. The strangest part, though, was that it had long, spike-like appendages on its back. Within about 5 seconds of seeing it, it ran into the bushes and hedges ahead of it, and it was gone. The speed and the way it ran were eerie. It is safe to say that I turned around and headed straight home at a pretty fast pace. I never walked my dog alone over that field again. As I said, this was 15 years ago, so any details of its facial features are pretty lost in memory. Plus, the time that I saw it and the speed at which it darted into the bushes were pretty quick, so I didn't really have the time to see any minor details. But all these years later, I still remember that day like it happened yesterday. Anyone have any similar experiences? I was a child of about 10 years old when this encounter occurred. I forgot about it until recently, when a dream sparked my memory. I was camping with my family in the mountains outside of my home. I was doing what all children do when camping and exploring the area, generally following the nearby river, when I came upon a section of river with 2 steep banks separated by a ravine cut by the river. I vaguely remember looking across to the opposite side of the river and seeing a couple small, pale, emaciated-looking people with pointy ears climbing up the steep embankment on all fours, and I remember wanting to jump across to try getting a better look but being really creeped out at the same time. It was very surreal. Even now, it's a hazy memory. I don't remember them wearing any kind of clothes, but they may have been wearing loincloths. I didn't see their faces because I only noticed them as they were moving away from me and facing away from me. No hair or fur whatsoever. It reminds me of the movie Monsters in the Descent. I had grandparents, Dad's father and stepmother, who lived in Willow Creek until their respective passings in the early 2000s. Before then, my dad, sister, and I would visit at least once or twice in the summer, sometimes for Thanksgiving or Christmas. We lived in San Jose, California, at the time, which is 8 hours away. We loved going to hike in the surrounding forests and play in the Trinity River. We grew up hearing about Bigfoot. The famous Patterson video was shot in the area, and the town is Bigfoot tourist heavy, but we were taught to watch out for the very real pumas and bears. This story takes place in mid-August 1994. One last summer trip before school started in a couple weeks was at the request of my sister for her 9th birthday earlier that month. I was 11 at the time. We left early to get there before dinner so Dad could nap from the drive a bit while me and Sis went down to the portion of the Trinity River that ran at the very back of the neighborhood. The afternoon and evening went as usual. That night, we went to sleep in the solarium, as was custom for summer trips. At some point in the night, I woke up. There is no real reason, not even to go to the bathroom. I just have always done that from time to time, even still. I did what I usually do and stared up at the stars and moon, around half visible. I couldn't tell you if they were waxing or waning. All of a sudden, I got an intense feeling of dread that skipped fight or flight to straight freeze or you're dead. After some time, most likely just a minute or two, I turned my head to the south to look into the yard. I had to turn to my side and lift myself a bit to get a better look, but the source of my feeling was impossible to miss. Standing at the bottom of the yard next to the neighbor's fence line stood a tall, skinny creature with skin the color of the moon. It had no hair on its head or anywhere else that I could see. Its eyes were shiny white with a reflective quality, but not bright, like a bright light was shining on them right then. Just the moonlight. Its face had. All was quiet for a while, so I peeked out through a small fold of the sleeping bag. Through one of the bottom windows of the solarium next to the door, I saw its pale, large feet. The skin was rough, and the toes were gnarled with dirty nails. I curled up, trying not to make a sound or move much. The bag was getting stuffy. The next thing I know, my dad is gently moving with his foot, asking if I was cold because I was still huddled down in the bag. I looked around, kind of disoriented. There was no evidence of that creature from the night before. No marks, footprints, or bent fencing. My dad was a huge skeptic of anything paranormal, cryptic, or otherworldly, but I told him anyway. He, of course, blew it off as a dream. Sis, being a deep sleeper, didn't notice anything. I asked my grandparents if they heard or felt the thumping on the deck, which would have been along their bedroom wall. Nope. Both seemed weirded out by my story, and my grandma later privately told me, "There's lots of strange things up here. That's why we avoid being out at night." She wouldn't elaborate, though. It's obviously not a classic Bigfoot, but I don't know what it is. I've wanted to ask someone from the Hoopa Native Americans up there, but I haven't yet. I've never seen anything like it since. This story is 100% true. I went to the Nebraska National Forest every long weekend with two friends, whom I will call Hallie and Todd. It was spring break last year when we went on a week-long backpacking trip. It was a 7-hour drive there. I, being 14, couldn't drive, but Hallie was 16 and Todd was 15. Hallie drove us there, and we had a great time for the first few hours of the drive. But when we go closer to the forest, something feels off. We were at the trailhead. I got out, and everything was as it should be. We grabbed our packs, and off we went. I felt like I was at home in the trees, and the feeling was soon forgotten. We walked a little over 5 miles that day before we set up camp. We had a 2-person tent that Hallie and I had brought, and then a hammock that Todd had bought. After we set up camp, we ate and were just chilling by the fire talking. There wasn't any alcohol or drugs. Todd began complaining about how he didn't want to sleep in his hammock. I didn't want to listen to him complain, so I offered to switch places. He gladly accepted. So the night went on like usual until around 2 a.m., when we all got tired and went to bed. Well, everyone but me. I have extremely bad insomnia, so I was just mending the fire and chilling. Finally, I decided to get into the hammock and read. So I put out the fire, garbed my headlamp, and got into the hammock. I noticed that something was off, but I couldn't place what it was. That's when it hit me, it was completely silent in the woods. No crickets, no animals, nothing. My skin started to crawl, something was off. I turned out my headlamp, laid down, and kept silent. I wanted to try and hear some type of animal to ease my worries. That's when I heard it. Something was dragging against the tent. I wasn't even 5 feet from the tent. It freaked me out, and I did something really stupid. I called out my friends' names. The noise stopped. I got no answer, but this feeling of dread was something I hadn't felt before or since. That's when I felt it. Something poked the hammock. It wasn't like a soft poke, it was like a jab. I was horrified. What the hell had just touched me, and where the hell was it? I was frozen. I also suffer from anxiety, and I felt the panic rising in me. I couldn't understand what was going on. That's when I made another mistake. I decided I wanted to see what had just jabbed me. All this happened within seconds. I reached up and clicked on my light. That's when I saw it. It was one of my nightmares. There was a creature about 4 feet above me staring at me, kind of hunched over. I was about 3 feet off the ground, so this thing was probably 7 to 8 feet tall. It looked like a dog, but it also didn't. It had the face of a wolf, but human in a way. The eyes looked red, the ears looked like clipped pit bull ears, its mouth pulled back in a snarl, and a hand, claw, and paw thing blocked its face. I was terrified. Its teeth were huge and sharp, and the paws, if you could even call them that, hand. 5-finger type things with sharp, long claws that looked like they could tear me apart. I stared at this thing for what felt like hours, but it was probably only 5 seconds. That's when I screamed bloody murder. As soon as I did that, this thing let out something between a scream and a howl. It was deep, and I could feel it. When I heard Todd yell, "What the hell was that?" I heard the tent opening, and that's when the creature and I finally broke eye contact. I yelled at Hallie and Todd to help me. I looked back up, and this thing was climbing the fricking tree. It was still staring at me. That's when I saw the back of it. It had the tail of a dog, grayish silver fur, a black mane down its back, and a hump. I took this opportunity to scramble out of my hammock. We took off without grabbing anything. I had no shoes, nothing. We made it to the car. But the whole time back, I heard something in the trees. The next day, we had park rangers go get our things because we were freaked out. When they got there, everything was gone. Not even trash remained. It was as if we were never there. They blamed us for lying. We had no idea what had happened. I had no idea what I saw or why it didn't just kill me. I haven't been back in the woods for a very long time, but still, every time I close my eyes, I see that thing and hear its roar.